how far can I push hatching as a technique, as a means of creating certain effects in my drawings? Over the last number of months, I've become more aware that hatching has become a more conscious tool of not just creating shadow and shade effects in our drawings, but as actually a more considered means of drawing subjects that would otherwise be fairly impossible, for me at least, to even consider drawing. And they've come to, in my mind, in my thinking, have equal weight with the thought of drawing lines or even other marks to create certain objects on our paper, that where the hatching is placed and where it's not placed, in effect brings into being certain objects that would be very hard to draw, to create any other way. Certainly in a more traditional thinking way of outlining certain objects or outlining certain shapes. Now, this drawing took me 80 minutes in real time, an hour and 20 minutes, and you're watching most of it at slightly over 4 times drawing speed. This section just a little bit more, where I'm using a 0.1mm pen to do my outline. Not that these are the outlines of my drawing in any sense. None of these marks particularly are going to be the defining marks of any part of this drawing at the end, but it's a means for me to, if you like, provide guidelines for the values I'm going to be creating with the hatching. And so now I'm starting with a 0.3mm pen, which I'll use for basically the lower half of this drawing and the tree trunk, and then I'll switch to a 0.2 for the further back sections. Now, this is a small gum tree, small eucalyptus tree, that's coming out from between a bottle brush, an Australian bottle brush bush, with a lot of other tangled bushes, plants around it, including some grasses in the lower right. Now, and this is a very, very typical Australian bush scenario. This dense tangle of lots of little sharp pointy bits that create lots of shadows, as well as a very jagged, irregular section of highlighted parts of the plants, depending where the light's coming from. I love looking at this, and I really enjoyed painting scenes such as this when I was doing my oil painting. However, drawing with a pen, with a multi-liner pen, this scene is a challenge. And since I've been pushing the boundaries, experimenting with hatching and seeing what effects I've been able to create in bush scenes, I thought that this, besides being a scene that I just really enjoyed so much looking at, that this was certainly going to be a challenge for me. So I thought it would make an interesting video. And look, I'm still not sure whether the drawing itself has enough clarity or not at the end, or whether it's just a little bit too tangled up with lines and marks. But I really enjoyed the process, and this is how we learn to push ourselves in a considered way. We don't want to go beyond what we have a chance of achieving something at least in, because that's just discouraging or could set up bad habits. But I thought at the very least, this would lead me on in my self-education of the possibilities with hatching, and also just to go beyond the narrow view of hatching that I used to have, that basically it was a way of putting shadows under colonnaded porches or on the side of the wall that's away from the sun, or the shadows being cast by the building. That it was a way of going beyond that and actually seeing hatching as a technique where I could bring into being what's happening in the scene in a way that just isn't possible any other way in a pen drawing. And it's not just hatching, but it's layered hatching, but not just in the technical sense of cross-hatching as layered hatching, but deliberately layering different, not just particularly the different direction of hatching, but hatching certain parts of the lower layers, but not of the upper layers, and so forth. So we're creating, if you like, gradations of value of starting with lighter shadows on parts of the plant that go deeper as we go further into the plant and create deeper shadows, but still it's not just black or white. We're giving a sense of parts of the plant that are not as clear as the sunlit ones, but not as dark as the ones totally in the center. Now, this big clump of grass on the lower right-hand side did take up a lot of time, and this is where we are drawing the effect of the grass, not the detail. I'm not drawing the blades of grass, the very long blades of these clumps of native grasses. I'm trying to capture the shadow effect and simply highlight a few to, my hope is, lead the brain to understand what we're looking at there. But I also want the line work here to have a very different feel, the hatching line work have a very different feel to the hatching line work in the rest of the drawing, to help indicate that this is something that is fundamentally different that we're looking at than the other vegetation that we have, than the bottle brushes, and there's a vine that's winding its way through all of this as well. Now, if you'd like to watch me draw this slower, use the cog icon and you can take it down to a quarter video speed if you want, and then you'll get to see it at only a little bit more than my real-time drawing speed. Or you could just do that for a part of it if you wanted to have a better sense of what the actual experience of drawing it was in terms of the choices I was making and the order in which I was doing things and the way the scene looked as the layers were built up in a particular part. And I have to say, I hadn't quite worked out how everything was going to work, particularly in the upper half. I did use my normal method of doing some experimenting with marks before I began to draw, and I did spend a little bit longer than normal. I probably spent 10 minutes, which is probably the same percentage as I normally spend on a drawing that took me 4 times as long as a normal drawing would. But just almost finishing a few select parts of the scene to see how they turned out. Just watching this when I was drawing it, in some ways it felt like it was a raging surf, splashing and foaming and surging in all directions. And I must admit, it still looks a bit like that to me at this point. Certainly the tree is a wonderful point of stability, just compositionally, and a resting place for the eye, and also perhaps the most obvious indicator of what we're looking at. Well, this is a tree, so there's probably shrubby vegetation around the base of it. But there's definitely some direction, and there's, with the different thrusts of the bottle brush book, the callistemon, that's at the base of it. And I'm trying to capture that. I'm also juggling the values and trying to create lights and darks. Now, clearly, there are parts here where I have to go very carefully around the silhouette edges of some of the leaves, particularly the leaves of the new growth on the tips of the branches of the bottle brush, because they stand out very prominently, partly because of their lighter colour and because there's more of them clumped together because the stem that they're on is still growing lengthways as well. And they will separate out slightly more as the stem grows from its growing point there. So now just starting to do some hatching on this tree and starting to consider, how is the tree going to work? How am I going to sort it out? Because in my final drawing, I won't have the benefit of colour to help create distinction. Because where the values are similar, where the amount of light or dark in the colour is similar to the light or dark level in adjacent colour, isn't such a problem when we can see the colour. when they're all reduced to grayscale, they can end up looking very much the same, and we lose the distinction that we get in life or in the photo. So sometimes I then deliberately manipulate the value and make one of them lighter or darker than in the reference, so that it's more easy to understand in life what it is. Again, I'm doing my horizontal hatching for the tree trunk, as you know I favour generally for trees, and being careful to stop and start them on each side of the leaves that are a lighter value against the darker tree trunk. And when we have a scene such as this, it is important to have a few spots, particularly spots where there is much greater clarity as to what we're looking at, to try and draw just a little bit more carefully at those points to show those points of clarity, those points of reference that we can more easily grasp what we're looking at. Sorry about that. I had about 4 or 5 minutes there where I didn't have the camera on. If you look at the center left of the drawing, you'll see that I've actually got some leaves there that are dark against the light background as opposed to light against a dark background. And that's because if you look carefully at the reference, that is happening there. There is some lightness behind that section. And I thought that was a great contrast to what was happening in the rest of the scene, and was also another way of providing one of these points of clarity, but a different one. And the more variety we can weave into our drawing with our marks and with the effects and the way we create them, generally the more interesting the drawing feels and looks, even if we don't know why. I've now switched to my 0.2, and for the background beyond this, I wanted to be very gestural. There is enough detail down below, and I also want to separate what's behind the tree. Now, there is a fence that goes behind the tree. Now, I was never going to draw the fence. This is actually part of the railway station entrance, and I didn't feel the fence was a necessary part of it and wouldn't necessarily even be easy to work out what it was. So I left that off, and now I'm doing this sort of towards the end of the drawing, going back over my values, looking at the reference, standing up, looking through the camera and thinking, where do I need to adjust the lights and the darks to either create more the effect that's in the reference, or to go beyond the effect in the reference and do what works best for the drawing. It also gives me a chance to see, now that I've drawn more parts in the upper half, is that working? Do I need to make more adjustments? Do I need to make some lightish parts darker? Do I have the clarity that I'm hoping for? Or do I need to think up what I'm going to do? I take certainly a lot more creative license with this upper part that I'm doing now. I'm not really trying to represent what's in the reference. I'm not trying to draw the palm fronds. There's a self-sown palm tree sort of peeking out from behind the upper part of the angled gum trunk, but I've decided not to worry about that. So just some very loose gestural lines that I hope can be easily read as this is more vegetation further back. This is a very thick with vegetation scene. And I decided to go darker than perhaps I normally would for the furthest elements, but I'm still using long and loose lines to give a more generalized feel, which I hope creates the same effect. And then we're getting pretty close to being finished. Here goes the tape, being very careful not to tear it. And if you've found this interesting, please, why not hit the like button for me? And just a few last details. Why don't you give it a go? But you could just try drawing a small part of it, just to have the fun and the challenge of exploring hatching in this perhaps different way to just putting the shadows on the side of a building. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this interesting. I certainly found it fun to do. If I was to do it again immediately, there are a few things I could tweak, I think, to get greater clarity, but it was a great experience and I'm glad I did it. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next video. Bye.